Well, good afternoon. I would like to take the opportunity this afternoon to return again to Dr. Paul's words to us about the importance of the next step, or taking even that first step, and why that is so important. Not only because where that will take you, but I want to pause for a moment and have you think about this, that there will be others who will follow your steps. That there will be others who may go nowhere because they don't see you move. But there will be others who will go precisely because they see you move. I would like to speak to all of you this afternoon about your role as leaders. Now, some of you may immediately identify with that role. For others, just think about this. A leader is someone with influence. Someone who influences others. All of you have people that you influence. Your sphere may be massive, or your sphere of influence may be small, but you are a leader. And I would like us to think together this afternoon about what Jesus taught about the one thing that most undermines the effectiveness of a leader. And that is, again, this one great challenge of fear. If you think about Jesus and his last night with his disciples, his core of leaders, he's going to send out into the mission into the world. What is the last command that he gives them? It is, do not be afraid. Because Jesus knows that fear is the most powerful force that stands between what his disciples have learned and what it is that they will actually do. Now, why is fear the fundamental challenge for us as leaders? Because fear is the silent destroyer of dreams. All great leadership begins with great dreams. In fact, the most iconic image in American history of leadership, of course, is about a dream. It's a picture of a Baptist preacher who was just 34 years old on this day when he was thrust into leadership of a violent and painful struggle for civil rights. And now he's standing before 250,000 people in the nation's capital, with millions more leaning in on television waiting to hear these words. And what in such a moment would a leader offer? Well, I can tell you the one thing that Martin Luther King Jr. was not going to offer on this day, and that was a dream. He had actually been up till 4 o'clock in the morning trying to prepare the text for the most important speech of his life. And he'd been up until 4 o'clock in the morning because his advisors told him, you got to talk about this, and you got to talk about that, and you got to talk about this, and you got to talk about this policy matter. And he's trying to reconcile it all. And then the next day, when King finally took his prepared remarks up to the podium, there was not a single mention of a dream anywhere in that text. So dutifully, King proceeds reading through his prepared remarks. But just as he seems to struggle over a certain awkward moment in the text, a friend yells out from behind, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." And those who were sitting behind him saw Martin Luther King Jr. grab hold of the text and set it aside. Grab hold of that podium and lean into the moment and roll out without a note on paper his dream for his nation and for his people. And what we now know is the "I have a dream" speech came forth from the heart. Leadership begins with a dream. And we all have dreams, and gatherings like this, they give energy to dreams, do they not? Haven't you been invited to begin to dream about what might be possible? But then it will be the power of our lurking fears that will threaten to destroy those dreams. Now, why is that? Because fear destroys the love that inspires the dream. Our most powerful dreams, and we've heard so many dreams in these days together, haven't we? These powerful dreams, don't they flow from a heart of love? We care deeply about something. We care about the opportunities in the Arab world for people to come to know Jesus through the healing hands, and that love produces a dream. We care deeply about something and we yearn for what might be, but then the fears come. What if it doesn't work? What if it fails and others blame me? You know, in my organization, the International Justice Mission, we have a dream about protecting the poor from violence. And it flows from a very basic love for individual people who are being enslaved and beaten and raped and robbed. And we just want that violence to stop. And after 20 years, we've actually, by the grace of God, seen more than 44,000 individual people being hurt who've been rescued out of that and been rescued out of the brutal hands of criminals. But every day, I will tell you, fear goes to work trying to destroy the dream because violence fights back. You know, not long ago in Kenya, our local team was trying to protect a poor taxi driver named Josephat from some police officers who were extorting money from him, and one day had actually shot him and left him for dead. And so Willie Kamani, one of the lawyers on IJM's local Kenyan team, wanted to try to bring these police officers to justice and protect Josephat. And so we were working to have these brutal police officers prosecuted. And then in June of last year, after a court hearing, Willie, Josephat, and our driver named Joseph suddenly went missing. And then 10 days later, at 3:30 in the morning, I was shaken awake by my daughter, and I picked up the phone and heard the news that the 3 bodies had been found in big plastic bags in a river because they'd been tortured and murdered by those police. Now think about, what do you think that does for your dream of protecting the poor from violence? Fear goes to work undermining the love that inspired the dream to protect Josephat and replaces it with what? A preoccupation with self now. Now the urgent question is, what's going to happen to us? Now surely this is a very severe example, but it serves, I think, to illustrate the point, doesn't it? Of the devastating power of fear over our dreams of love. And truth be told, I have seen far more dreams destroyed by a leader's everyday anxieties and insecurities than by these great fears of violence. Because it's these everyday fears that quietly lead us to abandon our dreams without a fight. Now you're saying, okay, Gary, I got it. It's about being fearless. This is another speech about courage. I've heard that speech. I've given that speech. Come on, let's go out and change the world. But before we rush out, can we take a moment just to consider a heads up on why this is going to be hard? Number one, you and I are not likely to know deep down what it is that actually scares us the most. I almost never started IJM 20 years ago because of fear. But not because I was afraid of the obvious or noble risks. To be honest with you, I actually wasn't that afraid of the violence of the work. I wasn't actually that afraid of the fact I was having to abandon my career in order to start working for a not-for-profit that didn't exist. And honestly, it was not the fears about, well, how am I going to take care of my wife and kids? These were the obvious, and these are the respectable risks. But when I slowed down enough to be quiet within my own soul, I found I was afraid of something else. I was afraid of being a failure. More specifically, I was afraid of looking to others like a failure. I was afraid of trying something really hairy and audacious, full of wild ideals and, yes, a dream, and then turning out to be just a public failure. It was this fear of looking like a loser, honestly, that for me was almost unbearable. But once I exposed what the real fear was, at least then I knew what I was up against, and I could ask myself, is that really the fear that I want to allow to kill my dream? And I could say no. No, I don't. And the dream had a chance to win. So here is suggestion number one if we want our leadership dreams to survive. We must relentlessly inventory our own fears with God. We must arrange our lives so that on a routine basis, we can, with a stillness and quiet in our interior, ask, what am I really anxious about? In this difficult situation where I'm feeling unsteady, what am I really afraid of? Because without this kind of rigorous self-examination, here is what I've seen happens. Leaders find themselves not being led by their conscious, hopeful dreams, but by their unexamined fears. And then because they're leaders who influence others, whole teams, whole ministries, whole workplaces, whole communities get to be led by these anxieties and insecurities. How important do I think this kind of rigorous inventory of the interior is? Well, at IJM, every day, everybody gets paid to do nothing but sit still in silence for half an hour to look with God at what's going on inside. Everybody, every day, for half an hour. It's called our 8:30 stillness. Everybody gets to work at 8:30, and for 30 minutes there's freedom from any kind of work, any kind of conversation, any kind of noise, or work of any kind, so that we can simply, spiritually prepare the quiet of the interior for that day. And what happens? Well, I, of course, invite you to try it. Sit still by yourself in silence for, let's say, 3 minutes. What will happen? Well, I bet it will be fears and anxieties and insecurities that will then start to bubble to the surface, which is 90% of the reason 99% of us hate to do this. So we can keep it all down and under control. But if you are practiced at it and attentive to the grace of God in it, can you imagine the strength of insight and the depth of self-awareness and the steadiness of soul that would emerge for your leadership every single day? It's a chance for a leader to step back and ask, I'm feeling a little bit shaky about this. In fact, I'm feeling pretty fearful, but is God in a panic about this? Is he all stressed out about this dream he has for me? Is he freaked out about how all this stuff is going to happen? Or perhaps he has a path, a way of peace, so that I don't have to be afraid. And can I tell you, based on my experience of 20 years of leading one of the most dangerous Christian ministries in the world, I have found that Jesus always has a path of peace, certainly of struggle and difficulty, but always a way of hope, and I will tell you, a way of joy. You can lead and influence like this every day on the strength of a regular and routine inventory of your own fears before a loving God every day. Here's my second suggestion for keeping your dream of love alive out there, the great church parking lot, which is the graveyard of all great stirrings of the Spirit that somehow find their death in the asphalt of the parking lot, right? So the inventory of fears, but also switch from playing defense to playing offense. No great dream of love has ever been built on a fear of what might go wrong, but only on the great and abundant hope of what might go right. So let me ask you this. And in this era, this is a challenging question, I think. At your core today, are you more impressed with what man is getting wrong in the world, or more impressed with what God is making right in his world? Because if you are fundamentally more impressed with bad men than you are with a good God, then fear is going to eat your leadership alive. You cannot lead forward in a pursuit of a great dream of love if you're actually leading a retreat to a bunker of safety. So here's the point, just that God is leading his people to stop living in the joy-killing fears of playing defense, but joining him in playing offense in the world. And I think that's who's here today. Those who actually showed up to be here at M3 to see how you can join the team of playing offense. But you're such an example to the rest of the world, because in so many other places, Christian leaders have gotten themselves so disoriented, right, with a narrative about fear and victimization that they act as if the gates of hell are advancing against them. But gates don't move around taking territory. They are built to keep advancing forces out. And as Jesus describes it, it is hell that is desperately playing defense. And against the advance of God's kingdom in the world, those gates cannot prevail. Now, as the leader of IJM, and formerly I was the director of the UN's genocide investigation in Rwanda, I think I know pretty well and intimately that evil is real, that loss is real, that the defeats are painful. But Jesus, on the night before the evil and the loss and the hurt of the cross, what did he say? He said, "In the world you will have trouble, but I have overcome the world, so fear not." What does this mean for you and me as leaders? To switch from playing defense to playing offense is to accept God's invitation to charge the darkness, to affirmatively advance into what is broken and hurting and wrong in the world, and bring his healing and his redemption and his justice. Let me give you a concrete example of this. One of the darkest evils in the world must be the business of child sex trafficking. It's a global business of selling children to be raped by paying customers, and it's massive. And 15 years ago, ground zero for this crime in the world was the traumatized country of Cambodia, where I could go to the streets outside Phnom Penh, and I could be ushered into the back room of a brothel, where I could find hundreds of kids on open sale to foreign pedophiles and sex tourists, and entered into one room where I was presented with a dozen children between the ages of 5 and 10 years of age who are being sold to foreign pedophiles and sex tourists. And so in the midst of this, what did the Christians in Cambodia do? In the face of that kind of darkness, what did they decide to do? They decided to charge the darkness. Christians joined with IJM and local authorities to rescue hundreds of these kids out of these horrific brothels. And we sent hundreds of the sex traffickers to jail. And then we were able to help with the church around the world rallying to help to build Christian aftercare centers that now set the standard for the excellence of trauma recovery for children around the world. And experts from outside have now documented the collapse of child sex trafficking in Cambodia. In fact, this is the cover. Amen. Amen. This is the cover of Christianity Today, Cambodia Rising, inside the country's thriving church and crumbling sex trafficking industry, documented by outside evaluation. This is the people of God playing offense in the world. And let me just close with this. Successful leaders of great dreams not only rigorously inventory their own fears, they not only switch from playing defense to playing offense, they do one more decisive thing. They forge a community of courage around them. Lone rangers do not make great dreams come true. Lone rangers make great movies. Movies are not real. The suffering and hurting world that we're coming to understand is real, and it requires a community of courage. Think about Jesus, who was God Almighty, and if anybody was qualified to carry out a vision of a Lone Ranger approach, it would have been Jesus, right? But what did he do? He gathered around himself a band of men and women and forged a community of courage. He poured into them, he invested in them, and loved them for years. And then on his last night out, he says to them, with them, do not be afraid. But then what is his strategy for them being able to secure that kind of courage over the long haul? It's forging a community. It is the power of a team humbly serving each other in love. So on the night he says to them, do not be afraid, he gets down on his knees and he washes their dirty feet. And he simply says to them, just love each other like this. Now you can imagine they would have said, but Jesus, where's like the manual on how we should like carry out the strategy and all this sort of stuff? No. Apparently for Jesus, he says, just love each other and all will be good. When I was shaken awake in the darkness at 3:30 in the morning and got that call about the 3 of our number who'd been brutally murdered by those police, I immediately knew that this whole dream of trying to protect the poor from violence would be fiercely assaulted now by fear for our whole team. And as my wife and kids gently drove me to the airport, got me on that plane, and I sat on that plane and stared out over the sort of the arc of the horizon, flying to Kenya to join the team, I knew that our survival in the face of this onslaught of fear would depend upon one thing. How well was this team loving each other? That's it. Would we, in the face of this violent threat, just kind of scatter in fear? No one would blame us if we did, honestly. Would we dissolve into frightened infighting and blaming each other, or denial, or maybe just quietly abandon our dream of protecting the poor from violence and actually take on a more realistic program? But when I arrived, I found something different. A team holding each other tight through the grief. A team staring down their own very honest fears and choosing to trust God and to trust each other. A team rigorously, yes, retracing their steps, asking hard questions, counting the cost, but then rediscovering the joy of one another. And in the end, they have all chosen to double down on the fight. Not a single member of the team has walked away. In fact, we have grown by 20%. Amen. It turns out that fear, like courage, is contagious. 5 of the murder suspects have now been arrested and they're being properly prosecuted. And now the most significant movement to end police violence once and for all has been launched in their country. Now why? Because the leaders forged a community of courage around one another, not lone rangers. You know, when I finally touched down in Kenya, I immediately joined our IJM team at the memorial service at the cathedral that was being held for these 3 murdered friends. And for a moment, everything shut down in Kenya because the memorial service was broadcast nationally, live across the country. And at the end of the service, honestly, as we made our way out of the cathedral, I could feel the weight and the uncertainty of this struggle. And honestly, I could just feel my own unsteadiness and weakness. But as I was walking out, I also felt a hand gently reach for me. And I turned around and I looked and saw a familiar face, the face of David Makara. David Makara, when David was just 10 years old, tragedy threw him out to live alone on the streets of the slums in Nairobi. Actually not alone, because he had to take care of his little baby brother. This is at 10 years of age. Life was hard and scary, and even the little life that David, this amazingly winsome young man, was able to actually put together, one day was ripped away from him by, again, some abusive police who robbed him and shot him and left him for dead. And when my IJM colleagues found him, he was actually chained to a hospital bed, his bullet-shattered arm amputated, and then he was facing trumped-up charges from the police who had abused him. But in the years that followed, thanks be to God, IJM's local legal team had won his release, and they had sent him to school where he hoped one day to actually study law so that he could help the weak and the vulnerable the way he had been helped. It was so inspiring to meet David almost 20 years ago. And now, nearly 20 years later, this was the shining face of serious courage and joy that met me outside that congregation at the memorial service. It was David Makara, among our very first clients in our struggle over 20 years to try to protect the poor from violence. And he wanted me simply to know, he just wanted me to know that he was well. He wanted me to know that this one street-time orphan had actually now graduated from law school, and he was carrying on the fight against injustice. And he looked me straight in the eye, and he simply said this, "Brother, we will win. We will never stop fighting. Don't worry." What was David doing there? He's building a community of courage around him, and he was inviting me onto his team. Indeed, not long ago, the newspapers in Kenya told the story of the country's newest lawyer, David Makara. And on the day he was celebrating his admission to the high court bar with his own family and with the IJM family, he took the time to send me a little note. And he said this, "Brother, may we always remember that we are nothing but servants in the battle. The real soldier is Jesus Christ himself." The real soldier is Jesus Christ himself. As a leader, you have everything you need in your heart to pursue this dream of love. Deep within you, past the distractions and the noise, there is a yearning for great goodness and a love that is irrepressible, that is from the God who made you. And that's why the make or break truth to hold on to is this, that the real soldier in the fight for all healing and all goodness in the world is Jesus Christ himself. That is the truth that will allow us to lead without fear. You've been given everything you need to lead the dream, to lead the struggle that God has placed within your heart. What glorious good might God do through you if your trust in Jesus left no room for fear? For He has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and a strong mind. From this place, hold on to the truth of Jesus as the real soldier in the fight, and let us together follow Him to bring healing to that world. Amen.